This workshop brings together diverse voices to unpack key concepts, engage in meaningful conversations, and explore actionable solutions. From understanding generative AI to discussing its ethical implications and the unique challenges faced in the Caribbean, we have an enriching agenda ahead. In this workshop, we will dive into the key findings from our survey and explore realities in the Caribbean. We will also take a closer look at the generative AI tools, and we will wrap up with a panel discussion featuring regional experts on AI and gender. So to officially start today, I'm delighted to introduce Paula Esturiz Cavero, Program Specialist for Social and Human Sciences, who will share a few words and welcoming remarks. Over to you, Paula.
Thank you so much, Angelica, and good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our workshop marking the end of UNESCO's 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence campaign. Today is International Human Rights Day, and it marks the end of the 16 Days of Activism campaign, which is a powerful global movement aimed at raising awareness and mobilizing action to prevent gender-based violence in all its forms. And the theme that UNESCO chose to explore this year is centered on gender and AI. We wanted really to examine how artificial intelligence intersects with the issue of gender-based violence. And the rapid growth of AI technologies presents both significant opportunities, but as well some challenges, especially when it comes to addressing the root causes and effects of gender-based violence. Today, we will focus on how AI technologies, including algorithms and machine learning, can be used to perpetuate, but also to combat gender-based violence. AI can amplify gender-based violence by reinforcing harmful stereotypes, but it also holds immense potential in the fight against it. As we discuss these issues, we will explore how AI can exacerbate inequalities, but can also be a powerful tool to advance gender equality in the Caribbean. The digital age has brought a new dimension to gender-based violence, particularly with the rise of technology-facilitated gender-based violence. And this includes different forms of violence, such as image-based abuse, cyberstalking, online harassment, all of which disproportionately affect women and girls and populations in certain situations of vulnerability. So these forms of violence are becoming increasingly prevalent. A study found by UNESCO recently launched, it indicates that 58% of young women and girls globally experience online harassment on social media. Addressing this issue requires a multifaceted and multi-stakeholder approach that takes into account policy, technological aspects, as well as social factors. AI systems, if not designed properly, can reinforce existing biases and gender stereotypes. And for instance, facial recognition technology and predictive policing algorithms can disproportionately target women, for example. On the other hand, AI can also be harnessed to address gender-based violence. AI-driven tools, such as real-time detection tools for online abuse, safety applications, and AI-powered platforms can provide support for survivors of gender-based violence. However, we must be cautious about ensuring that these technologies are really used ethically, equitably, and inclusively and are serving all of humankind. Without the adequate regulatory frameworks, AI could easily magnify existing social inequalities. Therefore, UNESCO has been a global leader in setting standards for ethical AI development. In 2021, UNESCO adopted the recommendation on the ethics of artificial intelligence, which outlines principles for ensuring that AI technologies promote human rights, fairness, and equality. Importantly, this recommendation emphasizes the need to integrate gender considerations in AI governance, whereby the development and deployment of AI technologies in the Caribbean and globally should contribute to advance gender equality and uphold human rights. So today we have a very interactive session. We really hope that you like its design. We have different guests that will be participating. Notably, we would like to recognize the young gender advocates from the Caribbean Sheroes Alumni Network who contributed in co-designing and co-shaping the campaign as well as this workshop. And our experts for today, Dr. Sean Miller, Carolyn Peller, and Dr. Dhanaraj Thakur. And of course, UNESCO remains committed to advancing gender equality and human rights in the face of AI's growing influence. It is critical that we take this conversation forward beyond today's workshop and to collaboratively identify solutions to these challenges known at the intersection of AI and potentially gender-based violence. in order to create a more inclusive and equitable digital future for the Caribbean. So to start the session, I'd like to introduce the facilitators for today, Angelica and Jacka. The floor is yours, and thank you so much. Muted.
Sorry. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to Unpacking AI. So this is today's morning show where we will serve up the latest insights on AI, gender, and social issues. I'm Angelica, and I'm joined today by my fantastic co-host, Shaka.
Good morning, everyone. Now, today's session, I think is really special because we're diving into the preliminary results from UNESCO's recent survey on the perception and awareness of AI-based discrimination among women and girls in the Caribbean. This survey was part of the 16 Days of Activism Against Gender-Based Violence, a global campaign to raise awareness and advocate for the rights of women and girls. Before we dive deeper into today's conversation, let's just take a moment to explain what our survey was all about.
So as we know, in the Caribbean, we have discovered that there's very little data and statistics available. So we are taking the initiative to gather more data to understand how women and girls in the Caribbean perceive and are aware of AI-based discrimination. Our goal is to explore how AI technologies may unintentionally perpetuate biases or even contribute to discrimination, particularly against women and groups in situations of vulnerability in the Caribbean.
Exactly. And the survey asked our participants, particularly women in the Caribbean over the age of 18, to share their experiences and thoughts on key issues, including how AI might influence decision-making in areas like job recruitment, social media algorithms, and customer service. We also wanted to understand whether participants considered that AI systems are biased against certain population groups based on race, gender, and cultural backgrounds.
And we are also particularly interested in exploring the impact of AI on Caribbean women and girls. Many of the questions in our survey focused on whether AI systems fairly represent Caribbean cultures and if they contribute to perpetrate harmful stereotypes about women and girls in this region.
The survey also looked at more specific issues like technology facilitated gender-based violence. This includes looking at forms of violence such as online harassment, cyberbullying, or non-consensual image sharing, and how these forms of violence might be influenced or enabled by AI-driven platforms.
So ultimately, our goal was to assess the level of awareness around AI biases, gather perceptions about the potential risk these technologies pose to women and girls in the Caribbean, and also highlight areas where improvements are needed, especially in terms of representation, ethics, and policy.
Yes, and the results are helping us to better understand what Caribbean women and girls are experiencing, what they are concerned about, and how we can take action to AI is used in ways that are fair, inclusive, and respectful of all cultures and identities. So the survey is still open. If you are interested, you can participate via the link we are sharing in the chat now.
Okay, so now we will start with sharing a presentation. So, breaking news, the results from the survey have now been sent in. Let's take a look at the perception and awareness of AI-based discrimination among women and girls in the Caribbean. Can you go to the next slide, please?
Now, did you know that UNESCO's survey indicates that 67% of Caribbean women have personally experienced or know someone who has experienced technology-facilitated violence? The most common forms we found identified by the respondents include online harassment, cyberbullying, and revenge porn.
Can you go to the next slide, please? So before diving into some more results, let's take a quick demographic of our respondents. So when you see here, we had a total of 45 responses, and most of the respondents, 45%, are the age of 26 to 35. So we will also see then that the highest level of responses actually came from here in Jamaica. And most of the respondents had identified as Afro-Caribbean. Can you go to the next slide, please?
Another interesting result is that nearly 44% of respondents felt that AI can be biased against certain groups, especially women and people from diverse cultural backgrounds. Another 31% responded that they are somewhat concerned about the bias, while 22% said they were unsure whether AI systems are fair at all.
So next slide. So this is actually quite interesting. Let's see what else the respondents are telling us. So UNESCO survey results reveal that many Caribbean women are aware of the underrepresentation of certain ethnicities and cultures, including Caribbean identities, in online searches and media. So a significant 70.7% of respondents said yes, that they do recognize this is an issue. 8.9 responded somewhat, indicating partial awareness, while 13.3 said no, they don't believe underrepresentation is a concern. Can you go next, please? And additionally, over 73% feel that AI systems fail to consider Caribbean people.
Now, I think the results are very eye-opening because they underscore that there's a crucial need for change. The fact that a large majority of Caribbean women are aware of this issue is already a strong call for action. Let's get our audience a little bit more involved. So we want to do a quick interactive poll. We've selected a question from our survey, and we want to see if your responses match the results we would have gotten from the survey so far. So the question is, are you concerned about how AI influences people's perceptions of Caribbean women and girls?
Okay, so I have around 68% of participants who have answered. Still more answering. We're getting to 72, which shows you are very engaged in our workshop. So from our results, we see that 69% are concerned. Somewhat is 28%, and 3% said no. While now looking at actually what we found in our survey, here in this workshop, more people are actually concerned compared to our survey, which indicated only 35.8 people are concerned about how AI influences people's perception of the Caribbean, of Caribbean women and girls. So now that we've set up the foundation, it's time to hear from someone actively shaping the conversation. So up next, we have a special feature, a video from Ruth Howard, who will share insights from groundbreaking research as it relates to technology-facilitated gender-based violence in Jamaica. Let's dive into her findings and see how they connect to our ongoing dialogue. Ruth Howard is a SHEROES alumni and a rights and gender justice advocate with a Master of Science in Gender and Development Studies with a distinction from the University of the West Indies Institute for Gender and Development Studies. She works as a program manager for Women's Media Watch Jamaica, We Talk for the Reduction of Gender-Based Violence project. A consummate activist, Ruth received Jamaica's 2022 Governor General's Achievement Award for excellence for her humanitarian work on behalf of women and girls in Kingston, Jamaica. Ruth was also a 2022 World Pulse Top 50 Rising Voice awardee and is currently a World Pulse Digital Ambassador and member of the PowerShift Inclusive Excellence Council. She was also Jamaica's 2021 Ubuntu United Nations delegate, and this year returned as a counselor for the 2024 edition. Ruth is also a membership and nominations co-lead for the Society of Gender Professionals. So we'll hand it over to Ruth.
Hi, my name is Ruth Howard. I am Program Manager for the We Talk for the Reduction of Gender-Based Violence project, which is being implemented by WMW Jamaica. I'm also a 4-time participant in the Shiro Summer School, sponsored by UNESCO and implemented by the Institute for Gender and Development Studies. So the We Talk project is a 5-year project that runs from 2022 to 2027. It is sponsored and funded by Global Affairs Canada and Oxfam Canada. So under this project, we're trying to reduce and prevent gender-based violence in Jamaica. As part of that effort, we conducted a research using artificial intelligence to analyze the perspectives and the discussions that Jamaicans have online around the gender-based violence. Now, we're very excited about it because it's a very novel piece of research and very unprecedented for Jamaica. The question we were trying to answer was, what are Jamaicans saying about gender-based violence online, and what does that reveal about our attitudes towards gender-based violence as a society? So we contracted a group called Quilt AI, and they did an analysis of over 15,000 social media posts, over 16,000 actually, and over 125,000 Google searches. And using that, they were able to extrapolate 11 key narratives that Jamaicans hold about gender-based violence. So 2 of the key narratives, or 2 of the most dominant narratives that we found, were 1, genderless violence, and 2, hypersexualization. Genderless violence is the belief that Jamaica does not have a gender-based violence problem, or that the focus on gender is uncalled for, and that where the focus ought to be is just on violence in general. The reason why that is problematic is because it suggests that gender-based violence is not an important issue, despite statistics and findings to the contrary. It also suggests that resources and efforts to address gender-based violence in the country are not important. Another dominant narrative that we found was hypersexualization. This one is very common. It is the objectification and hypersexualization and the commodification of women and women's bodies. And we see that everywhere. It's in our popular culture, especially in the dancehall space. It's in media, it's in news reports. Everywhere we look, we see that happening. Why is that problematic? It's problematic because it promotes the idea that women's bodies are for the sexual pleasure or gratification of others. And when they are treated like that, when that is the perspective we have, it leads to gender-based violence. It leads to no respect for women. And that, of course, is a problem. So one of the things we discovered even while we were doing this research was just how very little information exists in the online space about technology-facilitated gender-based violence in the Caribbean or in Jamaica in particular. And for us, that is an area of chief concern because we know that it exists, but we do not have the data which is necessary to support interventions and programs to address it. So this is an area where we've identified a gap that we are calling on all our Caribbean researchers to help us to fill. So one of the measures we took on this project in order to reduce bias was the hiring of a gender specialist to help in those initial stages where we were training the data for that would be used to analyze the online platforms. So let me put this in layman's terms. AI does not know Jamaican lingo or languages. So if I say jacket, AI does not know that I'm not talking about a piece of apparel, that I'm talking about paternity fraud. So we had to create literally a mini dictionary where we highlighted some of these key terms that we use when we're talking about sexual and reproductive health in Jamaica, when we're talking about gender-based violence in Jamaica, when we're talking about relationships, and then use that to calibrate the analysis to ensure that the artificial intelligence would be able to pick up those nuances. And what that taught us was that it is very important for us to be creating the research ourselves and to be using and calibrating the technology ourselves, or else other persons will do it based on what they think they know about us, and it will not be representative of our realities. The great news is AI is not the enemy. AI is a tool, and it is a tool that can be harnessed to help make the online space safer for women and girls. It is important that when calibrating, when training, when creating and generating information, we center survivorship. We ensure that we challenge the use, for example, of language that is incendiary, language that is discriminatory, language that is prejudicial, or language that is violent, hurtful, or harmful. As a Caribbean Sheroes alumni, I believe AI can and should be used to help combat technology facilitated gender-based violence, to make this world safer, not just for our women and girls, but for all of us.
It's always a pleasure to hear from Ruth. And like she mentioned, being a Caribbean Sheroes alumni, I hope there's other Sheroes in the chat who have attended the session today. So thank you so much, Ruth, for your powerful insights as usual. As we've heard, while AI can perpetuate harm, it can also, well, it also holds tremendous potential to empower women and girls, especially in the Caribbean. It's clear that how we shape and use these technologies will ultimately determine their impact. With that in mind, it's time for us to dive deeper into another key aspect, generative AI and its intersection with gender. How can this technology be both a tool for change and a challenge? We're going to explore that now. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Sean Miller, who is an assistant lecturer in the Department of Computing at the University of the West Indies Mona campus. Dr. Miller is an AI enthusiast with a deep passion for the process of creation. As a researcher, he is driven to discover new paths that not only impact the academic world, but also have real-world applications that improve quality of life for all mankind. Welcome, Dr. Miller.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Let me just share my screen right here. All right. Are you seeing my screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so good morning again, everyone. And thank you all for having me here. Today, I want to just do a brief presentation. And as you see the title here, Understanding Bias in AI. So I want to identify, address, and see how we can balance gender bias in machine intelligence. Because as was said before, AI is not the problem, AI is not the issue. AI is just a reflection of what we train it with. And we're going to see exactly how bias is formed in AI and what we can do about it. Now, the outline of the presentation that I want to give right here is first, we just want to talk briefly about generative AI. I mean, most persons here probably have interacted with generative AI in some way, shape, or form, whether that be text, image, or even speech. We want to talk about what exactly is bias, and then we want to talk about what bias is like in AI, or how it manifests itself. Then we'll look at some examples of gender bias in AI, and then we look at some scenarios where this type of bias in AI can be dangerous, and then we look at why bias is sometimes needed, and then how we can fix gender bias in AI. So let's dive into it. So first, in order to understand bias in artificial intelligence, we need to understand what is artificial intelligence. And it really refers to computer systems that are designed to perform some tasks that humans will usually do, because from the dawn of time, we have been trying to create ourselves, really. We want to create machines. We want to create artificial intelligence that's able to do tasks that we hate, and that's what we are trying to do. We want it to understand language, recognize image, so that we can give it the monotonous tasks that we do not want to do, so that we can enjoy ourselves doing something else. No, so that's the big field of AI. So you can imagine this circle as AI. Now, machine learning is a subset, a subfield of AI, where computers learn patterns from previous data. So you give the computer data, and it learns the pattern that exists in that data, and then creates a model that will then be able to define the world, so to speak. So it only sees through data. And that's a subset of AI. As you can see, the small red circle right there, it's represented just an aspect of AI. And then now generative AI is a further subset of machine learning. And this is a type of AI that creates new content. So instead of just learning from the data and able to recognize stuff as it relates to the data, generative AI goes a step further. It wants to create new things based on the data that it sees or it had seen. Cool. Now, how does it work really? Because in order to understand how it perpetuates or generates bias, we have to understand how it works. So how does it work really? And this is a very simplified flow of how it works. You have data, you train models, you get content. That's it right there. You have data, you train models, you get content. I mean, that's it right there. If you understand that, you understand everything you need to know about generative AI. Just kidding. But that's it right there for real. That's it. The data is input. So generative AI models are built on large data sets. And where do we get that data from? We get that data from the internet. We get that data from documents. We get that data from all over. And who generated that data? Human beings. Now, before I get ahead of myself, ask yourself a question: are human beings biased? Well, we'll talk about that some more. So generative AI models are built from large data sets, and these inputs don't only play a critical role in shaping the AI views that it is the view that AI develops. And the content that it generates from that view, it relates to the data inputs. So we have the data input, then we'll go through some form of training, and in this particular step, the AI learns from the input data. It recognizes the patterns because it's built on top of machine learning algorithms. So machine learning recognizes patterns, and it learns those patterns. And in the generation step, it generates contents from the patterns that it learns from the data. Nice. So now that we understand that, what is bias? So based on the Oxford Dictionary, a strong feeling in favor of or against one group of people or one side in an argument, often not based on fair judgment. Right? So it's something not based on fair judgment. So you have a feeling or favor against a group of people or a side in an argument that is not based on fair judgment. So let me ask a question, and you guys can see the answer right now. Which of these statements is biased? Only men can be engineers, or most engineers are men. Which one is biased? You might say only men can be engineers. That's definitely biased right there. That's definitely biased. But I would like to say that maybe most engineers are men. That's either a truth or is it biased as well? Well, it depends, and you'll see that as we go along. So the question is, what is generative AI actually doing when bias emerges? Is it making a statement, or is it reflecting what the data has reflects? Now, let's look at what is bias as it relates to AI, right? What does it look like? What does bias in AI actually look like? So AI bias occurs when the intelligent system produces unfair, inaccurate, or discriminatory outcomes due to bias that is present in the data that it was trained on or the way the algorithms were designed. I know it can be both. It can be, you know what's funny as well? I mean, we didn't go into the details of how machine learning algorithms and deep learning and neural network work. But when training, you actually have a term in the neural network called bias. So you have weights and bias. So it's inbuilt into the way how machine learning algorithms are trained to have bias. So let's get a look at an example. There can exist bias in healthcare, where underrepresented data for women or minority groups can screw or skew rather predictive algorithms, right? Computer aided diagnostic systems have been found to return lower accuracy results for black patients than white patients. We have applicant tracking systems that was mentioned earlier, where Amazon stopped using a hiring algorithm after it favored applicants based on words like executed or captured, which are more commonly found in men's resume. We have online advertisements, and in one study, bias in search engine ad algorithms, it showed Google displayed higher paying positions to males more often than women. So it has this emerging quality of being biased in very specific use cases, and it can be serious. Image generation as well. When asked to create images of people in specialized professions, AI art generation applications showed both younger and older people, but the older people were always men. So we see it in different ways, we see it in different shapes, we see it in different forms. The other day, we actually did an example of using AI and using generative AI specifically for entrepreneurship. And we asked the question, generate a prompt for an image of a farmer in this product. So we had described the product, and then we asked the AI to generate a prompt for the image that we will use for the product. Now, this was the prompt that the AI generated. And we took that prompt and placed that prompt into an image generator. And when it generated the image, this was the image. Now, what do you notice from this image? Anybody? What can you see from this image right here? Is there anything that stands out to you about this image?
I mean,
Well, it's quite obvious. What's that?
I mean, sorry, I didn't know if you have to unmute, but I said it looks fake. It looks AI generated. It just looks AI generated. If that was the main thing, and no black people, etc. It's
Well,
just
it definitely looks AI generated. There are definitely no black people here. Anything else?
Sean, in the chat, you're getting white men, no black people, all male, older white
Definitely.
men.
So it's obvious. And the prompt did not specify that the farmer is a man. So this is just a very small example of the AI being biased and saying that, oh, only men can is no, the question I should ask is the AI saying that only men can be farmers? Or is it saying that mostly men are farmers? Regardless of the answer to that, the actual technical answer to that question, it is irrelevant because it only generates images of men as farmers. So that's one example right there. Another example of AI being biased is in predictive policing tools. So AI-powered predictive policing tools are supposed to identify areas where crime is likely to occur. However, they often rely on historical arrest data, and that might prove a problem if you don't want to discriminate against certain sections of the community. Now, the question that we have to ask ourselves is bias a bad thing? So that was bias in general as it relates to AI. But let's look at some more examples, specific examples of gender bias in AI. So another example might be in text generation, where it reinforces certain types of stereotypes. So when prompted with the prompt, a successful entrepreneur, AI text models often generate content featuring male characters and attribute success to traditionally masculine traits. So that's an example right there. Now, the question that I have right here, as it relates to a successful entrepreneur, I mean, some of the models that I've tried recently, the pronouns that they use are neutral. It's neither male nor female, but as they go along, they're trying to fix this issue. But this is definitely one of them. In image generation, occupational stereotypes that we spoke about just now, the other day I prompted the image generator to generate images of doctors. And I mean, only one doctor was a woman. Image generation for occupational stereotypes, again, AI generated lyrics, prompted love songs from a man to a woman. So this defaulted to emphasize dominance and strength, while in the reverse, if we say from women to men, the prompt may generate lyrics focusing on subservience or emotional vulnerability. Now, the question that I have to ask is the AI system doing what it was created to do? Well, if you give it a particular type of data, it is doing what it was supposed to do. But what it's doing may have significant drawbacks or pose challenges to certain aspects of society and the wider population. Another example in gender and appearance, so prompts like an intelligent person, AI image models often depict males in formal attire with glasses, yes, whereas females are most likely shown in casual clothing with an emphasis on appearance over intellectual traits. But why? Why is AI like this? And I think we all know the answer. So these biases arise because AI systems learn patterns from the historical data. And where does it get the historical data? It's from the persons who actually create these AI models. So, and these often reflect societal biases. Most of these modern AI systems, these large language models, they are trained on as much of the internet that the creators could scrape. And as you and I both know, the internet is not a pious place, right? It's not known for purity and truth, right? So that's an issue right there. But addressing these issues requires deliberate effort. So it's not a matter of simply creating AI systems that are not biased. And why do I say that? Because although bias is dangerous, sometimes you might need bias. But let's look at some reasons why AI bias might be a significant issue. So, reinforcement of harmful stereotypes. For reason, generative AI can perpetuate and amplify societal stereotypes and embedding them further into mainstream discourse and decision-making process. Now, one of the things I've been hearing some of the news the other day about research in the effects of social media, especially on young men and especially certain types of social media. And the research is just coming out. The research is saying that it negatively affects the mental health of young women, especially teenagers, especially when they are comparing themselves. And they're finding out these things. I mean, social media is not new. This right here, generative AI, is relatively new. And the issue here is clear, right? And these harmful stereotypes, they're just being reinforced. Now, the algorithms that are used in social media, they are simply putting before persons images and videos that most persons like. So it's almost like a human echo chamber. When we have these stereotypes, we use this data that reflect the stereotype. We create AI systems that then create models that generate these stereotypes. They feed back into us, who then generate more data to create it. So it's an endless cycle. So an example of this tech generation used in AI generation used education material might portray certain professions, as we saw before, such as engineering as men and nurse as women, reinforcing traditional gender roles and discouraging diversity in career choices. And I mean, if we're honest, we can actually see it in ourselves sometime. I mean, the other day I was talking to someone, a friend, and I realized that he was a nurse. And then, I mean, I didn't say it didn't shock me or anything, but it's almost like I didn't register that he was a nurse. I thought he was studying to be a doctor. And like, oh, that's bias right there. The discrimination in hiring. So the reason, bias in text generation system, as we saw earlier, used to screen or generate resume that lead to unfair treatment, disadvantaging certain demographics. So AI-based hiring tools may generate gender responses such as assigning leadership qualities to male candidates and collaboration skill to female candidates, skewing the hiring decision. So that can be an issue as well. Major issue, if you ask me, is misinformation and polarization. So AI systems trained on biased data can produce content that subtly promotes discrimination and exclusion. So AI-generated news summaries or opinion pieces might emphasize stories favoring one gender or culture, skewing public perception and exaggerating societal divides. So we see that all the time. I mean, the other day I was listening to some news about, no, I think it was last year. Yes, I was listening to a podcast, a right-wing podcast, talking about how the AI system would never say anything bad about the Democrats, but always say something bad about the Republicans. So that is bias right there. I mean, bias is bias. And next danger in bias is exclusion from creative industries. The music or art generation tools might underrepresent certain groups or misrepresent cultural elements. So AI music generation, if your type of music is not popular mainstream, you probably can't get an AI music generator to generate lyrics close to what you would want or you would care to listen to. So those are some of the biases or rather, why bias can be dangerous. But in order for us to fix or address bias, we have to really know what our enemy is. Is our enemy actually the bias in AI systems? I would say not. But because bias is actually needed sometimes, and we would want bias in some systems. So in order to fix it, we have to know what the problem actually is. So an example of where bias is actually needed and we'd want to actually introduce bias into the system is, and we're going to look at some of them right here, cultural context and localization. So why is it needed? To generate culturally appropriate content that resonate with specific audiences. Now, one of the research projects that we're currently working on is related to healthcare delivery in African nations, right? Specifically women healthcare. Now we have to create that tool so that it understands not just women, it understands African women, it understands the diet of African women, it understands their language, it understands what they go through. So we have to literally introduce bias into whatever system we are creating for that specific purpose. And why is that? Because we are creating it for a specific context. So, an example of this, generative AI system used for creating marketing campaigns in different countries may intentionally bias outputs, right, to align with local customs, traditions. So you want it to appeal to a specific audience. So that's an example where bias is needed you need to introduce bias right there. If you want a personalized user experience, bias is needed right there. Specific type of music, you want it to be skewed to a particular individual if it is personalized. In healthcare and safety applications, to prioritize specific outcomes or demographic in cultural situations, you need bias to be introduced right there. Remember, for example, if I go to the doctor and the doctor asks me, the doctor takes one look at me and asks me, do you eat, taking my blood pressure, do you eat a lot of fried chicken? I mean, that might be considered bias, but the answer is yes, I do eat a lot of fried chicken. The fact of the matter is he needs that information to actually process whatever he needs to process to give me what I need to get. Now, content moderation and harm reduction, we need to introduce bias right here to prevent certain things from getting into the mainstream or getting into the hands or the eyes of those who we want to protect. No. So with all of that said, looking at it and why bias can be dangerous, why bias is sometimes needed and examples of bias, how can we actually address the bias issue that may exist specifically in generative AI and AI applications? Bias is not really the problem. Context is, right? And if we want to actually create a system or use these tools, that these are just tools that are reflecting what the data is. If we want to use these tools in a way that don't generate bias, we'll have to give it proper context. We have to use data sets that are not biased themselves. So the presence of bias in AI systems is not inherently the problem. What is the issue is the lack of context. So bias really reflects the human context. So AI systems are trained on human-generated data, which inherently reflect societal context, including cultural norms, historical trends, and human values. The problem arises when this bias is applied without considering the context in which the AI operates. An example, an AI image generator might show more male doctors because historically men have been overrepresented in that profession. This is not problematic if it reflects historical trends for archival purposes. But however, the same bias is harmful when applied to job advertisements as it perpetuates gender stereotypes. So we need to know how to use these AI systems and all right, where does this AI system come from? What is it trained on? Is it the best AI system for this particular use case? Bias, as was mentioned before, the appropriate bias can promote fairness. So in some contexts, intentional bias can correct existing inequalities. So to counteract gender stereotypes in professional roles, an AI we could create it, we could make it biased towards generating images of women just as much as images of men. And here we're deliberately putting in or introducing bias so that it can be unbiased, so to speak. So what's also important is the importance of transparency and flexibility. So bias should be transparent and adaptable to the context rather than being rigidly applied. So an example, an AI text generator for legal documents might need a bias towards formal, neutral language. However, for informal contexts such as social media, the same language might seem overly stiff. Making bias adjustable ensures it serves the purpose effectively. Cool. AI, in the end, AI really is a tool, and we give it the context. We give it the context. So we want to actually make AI tools safer. We actually want to allow persons to use them in a way that these type of stereotypes and biases don't negatively affect individuals. And one of the ways that we can do it comes through training more persons on how to use it and giving AI the proper context, and also developing these AI tools for specific use cases. One of the things that I often tell persons about AI is that this is not a silver bullet. This is not some super intelligent system that knows everything. It's not always right, right? It's not supposed to replace you. It's not supposed to inform you about things that will change your life. You are the user of the tool, and you're supposed to control it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Van Miller. So I was wondering that if anybody from the audience would like to jump in, maybe to unmute, to have a comment, to share something, or any questions. So please feel free, don't be shy, jump in, write in the chat.
Thank you, Dr. Miller, for your presentation. I really loved the reminder of the cultural context and why it matters. And human biases are not necessarily inherently bad, but the context matters. I think the conversation around AI has been a little bit around fear mongering. So I love the reminder of agency and the power we all have to take control of the narrative around AI, but also how we can influence it as well. Thank you so much.
Definitely. You're welcome.
Hi there. Are you hearing me fine? Good day.
Greetings, I'm hearing you.
Yeah, Urban Williams here from Trinidad and Tobago. We as you mentioned bias, it struck me very differently this time that it may be very difficult to overwhelm or to change some of the biases built into these large language models that have been developed, literally because of the size of training data that's available to train for everyone else. In other words, if you're comparing the data available to train for the North American context in comparison to training for the Caribbean context, you could easily find that despite your best efforts, there is still biases against finding yourself in those the resulting models. But as you were talking, what jumped out at me, various other jurisdictions around the world have been developing their own culturally relevant models from ground up, from the starting point of training their own foundational models. Do you know if there's any work at the regional level to do something similar? Something that's trained from Trinidad all the way up to Cuba that represents us, our history, in such a way that by default, it's speaking to our circumstance.
Okay. So you say from the ground up. So I'm not aware of anything being trained from the ground up. But currently in our lab, one of the things that we're focusing on, as I said, healthcare, is that we are actually trying to create, based on other models that exist, we're fine-tuning these models so that they are more culturally sensitive to our context and our body and what type of lifestyle choices that we would usually make, so that when we use these models for diagnostic purposes, they can actually give us relevant information. Because one of the issues, as you rightly mentioned, is that the representation is skewed, and it's obvious why it's skewed, because the persons who actually create these models, they are of that ethnic descent. And what we found was that this was information that was passed to me by another researcher, was when we actually have persons from the global south, so to speak, and African descent go to places like, for example, the UK, and they're getting health care, sometimes the medications don't work as they should, right? And that's because of the fact that these doctors have been seeing these type of patients over and over and over again. So they're not used to someone like us. And I mean, as I said, I hope I answered the question, but I'm not aware of us building anything from the ground up, because as you know, the building a large language model is not cheap at all, neither financially or computationally. So yeah, so what we are doing right now is fine tuning and trying to introduce bias, if you were, into these models so that they can best suit our specific needs.
Hi, so I have a question. You were talking earlier that you guys are working on developing AI in healthcare and how you're introducing bias. So my question relates to the fact that a lot of, say, the initial data is based on clinical trials. And in these clinical trials, we also see an overrepresentations of certain demographics, such as white men, young, and educated. So what do you do then with this base data, and how can we make sure that we see equal representation also in clinical trials, and how can this be kind of implemented into guidelines regarding AI governance? Like, for example, if you want to implement some type of health tool that is based on AI, that the system that it is trained upon is based on a trial that included people that are in your demographic, like in your country.
That is a very good question. And then that's the exact question that the research is trying to answer. So we're actually trying different approaches to see which one will get the best results as it relates to being useful in our context. So we're trying RAG, yeah, I'm not sure if retrieval augmented generation. So we give the AI a particular context to think in, because these large language models, they already understand language, they already understand certain contexts, but we try to hyper focus their context for our specific use case, give it information, culturally sensitive information, resources to use as a starting point, and then make a decision. And we usually find that even in simple prompting, when you give it context in prompting, it comes up with better results or better responses. So that's the aim of the research, really. Is it going to be solved with RAG? Is it going to be solved with fine tuning? Can we just use proper prompting or instruction tuning? We're trying all of this just to see what's the best way to get these models to be culturally sensitive. And as I say, yes, they have been trained in a particular way. But can it be retrained? Can it be focused? Can it be put in a particular context that will be useful for us? So that's the actual aim of the research. So the project is slated to last for 2 years. So I should be able to answer that question with more confidence in 2 years, God willing.
Thank you so much for your input.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your... Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, so what are you guys doing about the availability of data? So you're training it and you're introducing bias, but this bias that you're introducing is also based on data, right? So where are you getting it? Like, for example, I know currently we measure threshold in medicine in a way that is based on the threshold of white men. And that's not the same for, say, a woman that's giving birth. So if you have an AI that's say, okay, I'm gonna give this is like a stretch, but I'm gonna give this woman a particular like amount of painkillers to deal with this. So that is based on, say, the data of white men, but how do we get to the data for, let's say, an Afro-Caribbean woman?
That is it. That is part of the work as well. And currently, one of the reasons why we have partners in Africa, specifically South Africa, is because we have healthcare professionals there who provide data, specific data in that context so that we can use. So that's the aim right there, to make sure that the data that is being fed into these language models, into these systems to fine tune them, is actually the data that we want. So that is it right there. The collection of data is an issue, and that's one of the biggest part of the project itself, the collection of this type of data. So yeah, so that's not solved at all. So we just need to collect data. And as you know, in developing nations, the data collection system is not always digital, and even if it's paper-based, sometimes it's not reliable. And yeah, just that process is, I mean, that to me, that's the hardest part of it all, gathering the data. And when that is done, all we have to do after that is probably just put it in the machine and press a button. But yeah, you highlight a real issue right there.
Thank you.
Now, thank you so much for your insights and, of course, your wonderful presentation, Dr. Miller, an incredible deep dive. For anyone else with additional questions, we will have more questions towards the end of the session. So write them down, keep them around, because, we want to capitalize on Dr. Miller's time today. And of course, our other wonderful presenters that we will engage in throughout the rest of today's sessions. I mean, from exploring cutting edge tools to unpacking the ethical considerations and risk of gender-based discrimination, I think his presentation really sets the stage for us. And to build upon this, I want to invite some experts to continue our discussion on gender and AI in the Caribbean. Now, AI technology is rapidly shaping so many things around the world, but as we look at its impact, there are some important questions that we have to ask. Is it inclusive? And I think we've already begun that discussion today. And are we ensuring that Caribbean women's voices and experiences are reflected in the technology that is being developed? Our first guest expert is Dr. Dhanaraj Thakur, Research Director at the Center for Democracy and Technology. With over 15 years of experience, Dr. Thakur has shaped tech policy and public discourse on human rights and civil liberties in the online space. His work has featured in Wired, CNN, and The Economist, to name a few, and he has published over 40 academic works. A former Fulbright scholar, he's previously led research at the World Wide Web Foundation and taught political science. Dr. Thakur holds a PhD in public policy from Georgia Tech. Thank you so much for your time today, and welcome, Dr. Thakur. Now, I just want to start before you present, because in our survey, we saw that 44% of women believe that AI systems can be biased against certain populations, for example, based on race, gender, and culture. So my question to you is, what challenges do Caribbean women face when it comes to AI, and how can we address these potential biases and discrimination?
Great, thank you. And thank you for the kind introduction, and also to UNESCO Caribbean Office for setting up the workshop. This is a good question, and I wanted to kind of build on what Dr. Miller just presented, because it's a nice lead into this issue around some of the challenges. I think a good starting point, however, is the context of that we all live in as people in the Caribbean, which is a context of patriarchy and misogyny. I think this is important to understand the kind of foundation where we're dealing when we talk about gender and AI. And by that context, I mean specifically the way our society, and I'm from Jamaica, so I can more speak to that, the way Jamaican society might privilege men in both explicit and implicit ways. And so by implicit, we have things like the wage gap in the country. I think this applies to other countries in the Caribbean too. For example, by wage gap, I mean women make on average 62 cents for every dollar that men earn for comparable jobs. Or when you look at political participation, like women make up only less than 30% of MPs in parliament, for example. There's no laws, to be clear, right? There are no laws that prescribe that require this to be the case, but this is the reality because of implicit gender bias and discrimination. And then there's explicit bias, particularly in terms of online gender-based violence, for example. In my own research on paper published a couple years ago, we found that young women were 13 times more likely to be harassed online compared to men of the same age in Jamaica. So there's this both implicit and explicit kinds of biases, which ties into what Dr. Mel was talking about earlier. But I want to take maybe a slightly deep dive into those kinds of problems in terms of the challenges that women face, which goes to your question. So when we talk about explicit discrimination and online gender-based violence, I think one obvious concern that's coming up in many places with regards to AI is deepfakes. So deepfakes, as some of you might be familiar with, are like synthetic manipulations of people's identities and expressions, right? It comes in videos or images or audio, basically to make it appear as if someone says or does something they never did. As it turns out, the vast majority of deepfakes are pornographic and almost always targeted at women. In fact, you all may be familiar with what's called like nudify apps, which is the idea that people can take an image of a woman and then kind of undress the person in that, in that image, create a new image. These are the kinds of ways in which generative AI are used to create false images, but often sexualized images. And these kinds of generative AI, follow the same kind of, are basically what was mentioned earlier in the way they work, the way they function. But I'm talking about specific uses that are aimed at targeting women. And another way, for example, is through mis and disinformation, which I think all of us are familiar with this problem. But here it's exacerbated because generative AI tools are used often to create what's called gender disinformation. So this is mis and disinformation that's targeted specifically at someone's gender identity. And often you see that targeted at women politicians or women journalists, often in a sexualized way. And the point of this is, just as with all kinds of violence against women, it's not just about violence, it's about control. It's about men trying to control the narrative around prominent women in society, women politicians, journalists, and so on. And so with gender misinformation, what you find is that using Gen AI to produce images or fake images or audio to control the narrative around these prominent women, often to undermine their, careers, their political effectiveness, and so on. So these are some of the problems that we see emerging around the world, but I think this may also be potential problems in the Caribbean as well. There are other what I call implicit challenges as well, which is the way in which society takes our existing gender biases and how that plays out when we apply these kind of AI tools. So think about like things like Siri, Cortana, Alexa. These are all initially started with women's voices. Why is that? Think about how in fiction and movies, you often see the AI kind of embodied as a person. It's often as a woman, often as in a sexualized way. Why is that? The main reason why these things are happening is because these are about men's fantasies, right? These are about the male perspective dominating the design of AI tools. And this goes to a larger problem when we talk about the design of these tools. And we've heard previous speakers mention this, that often the majority of AI computer scientists and AI developers are men. And so implicitly, they're bringing their biases to this problem, to the application and development of these tools. And then a more recent example, a more prominent example is, of course, things like ChatGPT and large language models. And just to add to what Dr. Miller mentioned earlier about large language models, these are essentially tools, very powerful tools, right, that are trained to solve a prediction task. They're essentially meant to predict what you as the user might expect to see as an outcome, given like a prompt, for example. And the best example I got is ChatGPT. But bear in mind, it's not about predicting or providing actual factual information. It's about predicting what you expect to see. Now, that depends on the data. And if the data is biased, then clearly it's gonna predict things that people that are potentially biased and gendered biased and biased in gendered ways. And so there's a good paper by Kotek et al, and I'll share the link in the chat later on, that assessed several different large language models and found that they're 3 to 6 times more likely to choose an occupation that stereotypically aligns with a person's gender, that often these choices are aligned with people's perceptions rather than official job statistics. And often LLMs amplify gender bias beyond what is reflected in the ground truth. So these are kinds of these implicit problems that come up when you use things like ChatGPT or other kinds of large language models. So there are many ways in this is happening. I think on a general level, just to try and talk about how we address these problems, one is when it comes to societal gender bias, which is a foundational problem, right? The patriarchy, misogyny, and so on. This often comes down to individuals thinking more reflectively, particularly men, of their role in these systems and what they're doing. And then in terms of these explicit problems, for example, an example mentioned earlier was like, job discrimination, or worse, things like online gender-based violence or deepfakes. This is where we need policy solutions that can prevent and protect people from these kinds of harms. And there are emerging solutions already. Online gender-based violence is not a new problem, and we've seen policy initiatives that try to address this in Jamaica and in the Caribbean. The next step now is how to modify and improve these to in the current reality of generative AI.
Okay, thank you very, very much. But now we will turn to our second expert, Carolyn Purcell. So we are joined here today by Carolyn, an expert in emotional intelligence, cultural leadership, and social impact innovation. She is a founder of Sister Talk Group and KDPM Equity Institute, where she integrates emotional intelligence with ancestral leadership to foster purpose-driven leadership and psychological well-being. Carolyn has been featured in Cityline, Chatelaine, Oprah's Live Class, and the Globe and Mail. She leads corporate retreats and develops leadership programs that promote inclusive cultures. Carolyn is also launching Kofa AI, an AI-powered platform for coaching and mentoring leaders and innovators. So I welcome you, Carolyn. To begin it, I just also want to just quickly mention, because we are running fast on time, could we please keep the answers to 5 minutes, please? Just because we want to finish on time as well, to respect people's time too. So our survey also reveals some alarming trends about the lack of representativeness in AI data. Many respondents are aware that some AI algorithms underrepresent certain ethnicities and cultures, including Caribbean identities. We also found that only 4% of respondents believe AI systems are developed to understand or respect Caribbean cultures and identities. So how does the use of limited or underrepresentative data in AI development impact the fairness and accuracy of AI systems, particularly in reflecting the experiences of Caribbean women?
Thank you so much, and thanks everyone who have presented so far. I think a lot of that has been touched on by Dr. Williams and Dr. Miller, and the previous speakers. What I would like us to think about is to think about cultural equity from a different point of view, meaning that how do we decenter the patriarchy and paternalism that continues to show the deep divide or the stereotypes that historical data brings forward? I think one of the ways that we can do that is to empower local AI initiatives, especially women focused groups. But most importantly, let's keep the education going. So we know that AI is biased. And as Dr. Miller mentioned, intentional bias is good. So what I've done as a woman from the Caribbean, born and raised in St. Lucia, funny enough, I wasn't raised with technology. I grew up in the bush. So I am what y'all would call a bush girl. But I have been in Toronto, Canada for the past 20 years. Our proprietary leadership program called Leap to Equity, where we educate C-suite leaders and those with systemic power. around systemic oppression and the difference they can make by integrating human and cultural equity as part of their leadership behavior and practice. That's one pillar. But I don't think we can wait for those systems to become equitable, because AI is human-made intelligence, right? Unfortunately, we have allowed our human biases to drive those stereotypes that we're seeing today. And we can't wait for that historical data to become equitable. So what I would say is, for everyone on the call, especially for men, when you think about the doxing and the technology-based gender violence online, look at where the data is going. So I think we need to double up on the urgency of bringing men together and educating and having conversation, while simultaneously supporting women who are building AI-driven tools, AI-driven data, AI-driven language modeling. With Kofa AI, what we are doing, we have built a very intentional bias around centering the voices, the experiences in terms from a cultural context perspective. And our modeling is actually going first to data sets and psychological safety and emotional intelligence programs that we have built and created. And that's coming from 20 plus years of data. Definitely not a huge, or I would say humongous data set, but what we've done is that we built on ChatGPT's language modeling. And what we're saying is that we need to mentor and we need to coach not just leaders, but also young women and girls. So we do have a Kofa AI for sisterhood and community, where we can not just encourage and empower women and girls to run, hey, here are the women and girls who are advancing AI in a responsible and ethical way, but also here's what you can do. Because everything that you use on the internet, it's being used to train those large language models. So when we think about our live data as which might be technically colonized, or I think it already is being colonized, it's being repackaged and resold to us in so many different ways. So one, focus on us building new pathways around cultural equity in terms of, I don't know if I can call it preventative, but I see it as a form of, because when we re-educate and we bridge those educational gaps around our ancestral knowledge systems, we bring cultural context forward in an empowered way, that not we only reclaim our cultural identity and inheritance, but we're also integrating that knowledge in an intentional way as we continuously, break down those systemic barriers that currently exist in AI. I think we're kind of behind the A ball, and we will be, but we need multiple streams of action, but also collaboration as well. Because I've heard so many great insights and research that has been shared here, especially at UNESCO. But how are we also leveraging that data collectively so that we can not just inform our different initiatives, but we can work together smarter and better as well? So check out Kofa AI. I'll put the link in the chat. We've just built our MVP, and we're looking forward to working with all of you on the line and beyond. Thanks so much, Angelica, for having us.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. Amazing work you're doing, especially, me looking at another girl from under the bush in St. Lucia. It's always good to have that kind of representation. Now, I want to jump back to Dr. Thacker just quickly. Looking at the role of the Caribbean community itself, our survey found that many respondents feel that Caribbean society is not fully aware of biases in AI systems and the impacts it could have on marginalized groups like women and girls. Only 2% of respondents believe that we're adequately aware of these issues. What do you think the Caribbean community can do, or what role can it play in holding AI companies accountable for harmful AI outputs?
Great, thanks. I just want to second the comments by Carolyn and what she said about Kofa AI. I think a lot of that follows what emulates, what others in the Caribbean community could do. For example, like local model development, development of local data sets tailored to our specific needs, which could address some of these problems that we see when you look at how the current foundation companies, the foundation model companies, draw on data sets that are scraped off the web globally. And as some of you may know, there are more men online than women globally. That's not the case in the Caribbean, but because the models that we are using, like ChatGPT, we end up with these kinds of biases. So supporting entrepreneurs and initiatives like COFE and others, I think from a policy point of view could be very important. That could come through like subsidies, investments, and so on from governments to support these kind of locally driven companies. They should also prioritize the gender diversity in these companies. A lot of computer science graduates at UWI are skewed male, even though at least when I was at UWI, there was a big discussion about how there are more women than men at UWI, broadly speaking. But within computer science, that's not the case. So I think where governments can think of incentives or ways to push greater diversity and bring multiple viewpoints into development of AI companies, models, and data sets, that would be great. And the last thing I'll say is that a lot of the problems here, now I'm speaking more as an academic, a lot of the problems here that we see that come from bias and discrimination, particularly around gender in AI, is not something that we can leave to computer scientists to resolve by themselves. Computer scientists are great. They're developing these really powerful models, but this requires social scientists, humanities, people like musicians, artists, many other people to be involved in that solution-oriented discussion. And unfortunately, at least when I was at UWI, and I think this is still the case, the narrative is still being led by computer scientists. And that's no offense to them, they're developing these great models, but if we're talking about societal solutions, we need everyone on board. And that then is my dig at social scientists at UWI and the humanities and others. They need to be involved in these discussions around AI as well. Thanks.
Thank you very, very much. Those are very, very important points as well to keep. And we have also found that the lack of diverse data can have far-reaching consequences. 51% of our survey participants reported noticing and somewhat noticing biases in AI-driven ads or recommendations that seem to assume stereotypes about Caribbean women. So this leads us to a bigger question. Carolyn, what impact do you think that AI has on reinforcing stereotypes and or gender biases about women and girls from the Caribbean?
I mean, everything that was just said, what we'll see is a very skewed society, but also the impact on our social identity will be quite devastating. And I think one of the things that we'll see, especially when it comes to recruitment, AI-driven, we have more and more AI-driven recruitment tools. The inability for them to recognize Caribbean, whether it's dialect or cultural nuances in terms of how we say things or even how we approach things, even from a language modeling as well. I'm pretty sure a lot of you have seen how ChatGPT, now it can speak patois, and now it blows my mind how quickly it's adapting, but it's not adapting with the cultural context, right? So there will still be that discrimination or that bias a lot of folks will face when they either, apply for a role or even when it comes to health as well, in terms of recommendations for solutions. And also it will continue to reinforce the stereotype around Caribbean women as leaders as well, as being taken seriously in terms of our brilliance or our ideas. So the implications are far-reaching, and this is why I believe we need a multi-pronged approach. I really loved what was said earlier, Dr. Tucker, around the social scientists, humanities, artists, and cultural storytelling. And this is something we really see as equally important. And it's not just about the machine learning or the AI experts. It's actually all of us, every single one of us, whether or not you're in the AI world or field, you actually have an impact and you have agency to influence AI in a positive way. If you're online, if you're using your phone, sometimes we think AI is this big machine that's going to take over, but actually we are the ones driving AI in so many different ways. So as we continue to work for a systemic and a sustainable solution, I want to just encourage and remind everyone, when you show up as your culturally authentic self online, you use your accent, you take the knowledge from your grandmother, your grandparents, because a lot of that language or that data is not online, but we hold it, right? And especially as Afro-Caribbean people, a lot of our culture is passed down through storytelling or through nonverbal cues. So I want to encourage you to share that. If you're going to share share your precious life data online, share it in a way that will not just reinforce your cultural inheritance, but you're creating a new narrative around cultural intelligence that will influence AI in a more positive way. I always say, when I'm gone and people look at anything that I put online, it will reflect my Caribbean heritage. It will reflect my upbringing. It will reflect my Creole language, Nukapali Patois. I want that to be a part of the narrative because I'm just so proud to be a Caribbean woman. I'm so proud to be a St. Lucian woman. And I will make sure that the world knows that mark before I'm gone. And I hope it's the same for all of you as well.
Thank you so much. Thank you both. Thanks to our experts, our presenters for your knowledgeable presentations today, your thought-provoking answers, and just being so engaging and so empowering as we go through today's session. Before you wrap up, I want to highlight that one of the key findings from our survey, it was 87% of our participants, they believe that more awareness and education is needed in the Caribbean to address AI bias. And I think we did speak significantly about that today, the need to invest in education and get more people from the Caribbean into the field and empower them as they navigate the field. And I think this highlights the need for a collective effort throughout the Caribbean. We saw Dr. Thacker take his jab at the sociology field at UE, yes, to get involved and not just leave everything to the computer science, those in the computer science field. As we've heard today, AI can be a powerful tool, but it's crucial that it works for everyone, including Caribbean women and girls. Through our continued dialogue, education, and accountability, it's known that we can move forward to a more equitable and inclusive digital future. Again, thank you for sharing your insights, and to everyone joining to participate today, we thank you for joining us, and we look forward to continuing these conversations and making a positive impact together.
So in closing, we will share our key takeaways from our survey findings. So first up, we can see that awareness is growing. Many women across the Caribbean are becoming increasingly aware of the potential biases in AI, and they are ready to take action. In fact, 67% of Caribbean women have personally experienced or know someone who has experienced technology-facilitated violence. This awareness is fueling a drive for change as women recognize the urgent need for a more inclusive and a fair system.
Secondly, there's a call for more diverse data representation. AI systems need to better reflect Caribbean cultures and identities to ensure fairer outcomes.
And as Jacques has mentioned, 87% of respondents highlighted a need for more education. People want to know how AI works and what steps can be taken to reduce its risks. So we have covered a lot today, but this is just the beginning of an important conversation. And we cannot wait to see how this dialogue continues beyond the 16 days of activism.
Now, that's all for today's session on Unpacking AI. Thank you to our guests and our audience for tuning in. Remember, your voice matters. Let's use it to shape a future where technology works for everyone. At this time, we'd like to invite you for your questions and comments.
So Niana, I see your hand went up. Go ahead, you can turn on your mic.
Yes, thank you. I was patiently waiting for someone to recognize me. Good afternoon, everyone. Well, I think it's morning in Jamaica, actually. I don't think it's quite afternoon yet there. But good morning, good afternoon, good night, everyone. And I would just like to thank you, UNESCO, for hosting this. I think it was very much needed and it was very informative. I learned so much. So thank you so much. And I understand that the survey is still ongoing. I'm not sure if I missed this earlier, but I wanted to know when exactly you will stop accepting responses. And I would also like to know when it will be available to the public. When will the final results be available to the general public? And also something else that I would like to know is how can I, as a young individual, be more involved in and contribute to this amazing cause? Yeah, that's all I have.
So the survey is still up. We haven't decided a day yet when to close it because we are looking at maybe continuing on and building upon what we have started here. So once there is a closing date, etc., we will obviously share it out again and you will be informed. And the best way, because I'm a young woman as well, coming from my point of view, is be engaged in it, learn about it. For example, even you attending this workshop, taking part in it is already a step forward. So that is, I suppose, my take on it is engage, become more aware, learn more about it, and stay up to date with what is happening.
And if I may also jump in, Angelica, thank you so much for the interest, and it's great to see so many young people participating today. From UNESCO and in collaboration with these amazing partners and experts that have joined us today, there will be more opportunities for capacity development and training because we've identified that this is an area that has a lot of interest in the region and where there's still the potential to find to do further research for more data. So also from UNESCO side, we will be able to share with you, Miana, other opportunities for engagement if you're interested. So you can follow us on our social media channels and also through our different, I think we also have a database where we have for young persons that are interested in UNESCO's work and that we can share information with them. Are there any other final questions? If not, we will wrap up. It has been super engaging, and thank you so much to our experts that joined us today. Ruth, Dr. Miller, Carolyn, Dr. Thakur, who are with us sharing their expertise. And I will also like to give a round of applause to Angelica and Jacka, who jointly facilitated and co-designed the workshop. So there's a lot of youth-led action as well from our office. And Jacka is part of our alumni, Shiro's Alumni Network. So she's also a very young gender advocate. So thank you so much for joining us. We will keep in touch. As I said, there's continued work and there's different opportunities for collaboration. Thank you for joining, and until next time. And happy International Human Rights Day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.